Hello again everyone, and welcome back to another Victoria 3 video. My name is Derail, and today we're going to be going over all of the principals in the game currently and kind of ranking them on a tier list from S through F. This is kind of in the nature of pretty much any other tier list video that you've seen on YouTube, except it's focusing much more on the usefulness of many of the principals introduced with the latest DLC, Sphere of Influence. I'm going to be ranking these based off of my personal enjoyment and usage of them. I've used quite a few of them, and I think some of them are definitely more useful than others. However, do keep in mind, all of these have some niche use cases. Even if I rank something as C or B, A, I could be wrong, it could just be my playstyle that you disagree with, and also it could just be something where a nation that I'm playing or I enjoy playing is more useful with a specific principle than, for example, something that you choose to play, so keep that in mind, and without any further ado, let's get into this. To kind of break down how I'm going to be ranking things here, if I'm going to give something an S, it's because it's useful in practically all situations for practically all countries. If something gets an A, that doesn't mean it's worse than S, but it might be a little bit more niche, and you might not be able to use it with specific setups. If something is B tier or below, that's because I feel like it does have a specific flaw that makes it worse to utilize than other specific principles. For example, something like defensive cooperation, in my opinion, is not as good as something like vassalization or something like construction, for example. Alright, starting off with freedom of movement, I'm going to start by giving this one an S. The reason why I do that is that tier 1, you get plus 25% migration quota for all your block members, then you get plus 50% mass migration attraction, which is really nice, and then you wrap it up with increased exchange for arts academies and universities, which gives you another 20% migration attraction for the states that have those, universities and arts academies. And I've got to say, getting people into your country in this game is incredibly important for building up a massive GDP, especially later in the game as you get things like multi-cult. It is incredibly useful, and you can absolutely go crazy with something like this, especially as you keep playing. I don't even think I have multi-cult at the moment, but I already have a few mass migrations, and I have a huge amount of potential targets, all of which have excellent mass migration attraction. As you can see, I also have some bonuses from the specific traits as well. It's just a great perk. I think this is usable on almost any state of any size. It's even better on bigger nations if you're playing as America, if you're playing as Qing, as Russia, even as Britain. You can get a crazy high population, which is super nice. Next up, we have something like construction. I'm also going to give this an S right out the gate. This is because you get 10% state construction efficiency for the first perk, which is super solid. Then you get negative 75% infrastructure usage of construction sector buildings, which is, once again, a very great perk for pretty much any sized country. And finally, you get United Construction Conglomerate. This is a great company. You get glassworks, you get tools, you get steel, and also at 100 prosperity, you get plus 20% throughput for construction sectors. Very, very great perk. This is something I highly recommend if you're someone who wants to build up in terms of your GDP and get your construction going very, very nicely. Next up, we have Vassalization, and I'm going to have to give this one A, not because it's significantly worse than Construction or Freedom of Movement, but because this one's very much focused on getting as many subjects as possible, and if you don't have very many, it is not going to be super useful. At Tier 1, you get plus 25 authority per subject, at Tier 2, you get bonus income transfer from subjects, and at Tier 3, you can enact decrees in subject states. Tier 3, in my opinion, isn't too crazy, but Tier 1 and 2 are very good if you're playing a big nation with a lot of subjects. For example, Britain is the most important one, and I love using this when I'm playing as Britain. But if you're playing as a nation where you don't have very many subjects, if you're playing as a small nation, you are likely going to be skipping something like vassalization, and for you, it might not even be A tier, it might be B tier or worse. I'm also going to be honest, if you don't have any big subjects, this is not going to be too crazy. Yes, the authority is very nice, but there are other perks that you can get from this grouping that are better for authority than the 25 authority per subject. At the same time, though, if once again you are playing a huge nation, this can go absolutely crazy. It is very dependent on your nation's size. Next up, we're going to go over advanced research, and I'm going to give this one a very high A, or maybe even a low S. The reason for that is because at Tier 1, it gives you plus 25% technology spread, At tier 2, you get a minus 25% ahead of time penalty, and at tier 3, you get plus 25 maximum innovation investment. This is very good, especially for military technology. If you want to get ahead of other nations, build up your military, this is absolutely huge. If you want to get a better society tech very quickly, this is also incredibly huge. The only reason I'm hesitant to just give it a flat S out the gate is that I do feel like certain other principal groups are a little bit better. So you are going to have to keep that in mind. It's up to you. Next up, we have defensive cooperation, which in my opinion is in B tier or maybe even in C tier. At tier 1, you can no longer start or join wars amongst power block members. At tier 2, you get a minus 50% sway maneuver cost for the diplomatic play target. And at tier 3, you can call power block members with the call ally sway in defensive diplomatic plays. I'm going to be honest, none of these really entice me. Tier 1 is frankly not very good. I like the ability to declare war on or go to war with any of my power block members whenever I want, for whatever reason I may end up having, and using this just doesn't really benefit me. Tier 2 is also not very good. Sway maneuver cost isn't really that huge of an issue, especially late game when you get a ton of maneuvers. And finally, Tier 3 is also not very good. In defensive diplomatic plays, I'm usually not losing anyway. I don't really know the reason why I would need to call in all my power block members in the average war. It's cool, but not very beneficial. Next up, we have food standardization, which I personally give an A. This is because it gives your power block members 10% agriculture throughput, then minus 10% mortality, and then finally plus 1 standard of living, as well as efficient canning practices for your food industries. While this is a pretty solid production method, and the perks are very, very nice, I don't feel like this rises to the level of S like some of the other traits do. Something like construction, in my opinion, is a little bit better. Although I do imagine if you have an agrarianism setup, maybe this can go absolutely crazy. Also, if you're trying to max out something like standard of living, this could be very good as well. In my opinion, though, something like freedom of movement is just flatly better. Next up, we have police coordination, which I'm also going to be giving a B or maybe even a C. Even though I do like this, it's not very amazing in my opinion. All your block members get plus 50% institution size change speed for law enforcement, and also you get minus 50% bureaucracy cost of law enforcement. At tier 2, you'd also get 50 authority for every level of law enforcement, and then you also get minus 5% political movement radicalism at tier 3. This is nice. You do get a total of minus 25% political movement radicalism and 250 authority from this. As well, the overall block member perks are really neat. But personally, I think there are way better options that you can go with, and once again, there are better things in terms of authority that we'll get to later. Next up, we have transportation infrastructure, which I'm going to give a very high B and perhaps even a low A to. At tier 1, you have plus 33% infrastructure per 100k population and 33% maximum infrastructure from population. At tier 2, you get plus 20% convoys, and at tier 3, you get 50 land trade capacity, which is pretty nice, I'm going to be honest, and also some joint steam, electric, and diesel trains, which is also really nice. However, I don't feel like this rises to the occasion like some of the other principles and traits do. I will say this is very solid for specific countries and setups, but I myself have not personally had a lot of experience with this, I'm going to be completely real, so I don't rank it as highly personally. If you like this though, that is totally fine. A lot of these are very much usable, even if I'm personally giving them a little bit of a lower rank. Moving on, we have militarized industry, which I'm going to be honest, I'm going to have to put it in A tier. Probably a low A tier, but it is really solid. The reason why I say that is because at tier 1 you get plus 10% war machine, arms, artillery, and military shipyards building throughput. At tier 2 you get a flat 15% reduction in the cost of military goods. And then at tier 3 you get minus 33% supply route cost. However, aside from the fact that I'm putting this in A, it's a much more niche A than some of the other ones on this list. This is only useful if you're going for a very specific military goods reduction cost build, and otherwise I would put it in B tier or maybe even in C tier. generally you don't need throughput on a lot of these specific buildings. Also at tier 3, I forgot to mention, it gives you balloon reconnaissance, which I'm going to be honest, is also pretty nice, but at the same time, I don't think this makes it S tier by any scale of the imagination. It's just solid for certain setups, and otherwise it's nearly completely useless, especially if you're someone who likes to use diplomacy a lot more than your military. Next up, we have Colonial Offices. This is another one that I just don't generally think is very good other than for specific setups. I'm going to put this at a high B, but in certain cases, once again, I will give it credit enough to A, and maybe even to S because of one specific part of the perk. At tier 1, you get plus 50% institution size change speed for colonial affairs, and also minus 50% bureaucracy cost of colonial affairs. At tier 2, you get plus 0.05 colonial growth generation per tier of colonial affairs. And then at tier 3, you get minus 50% infamy generation against unrecognized powers. I will say, this is incredibly good if you're playing as a bigger nation and you're conquering a lot of areas around the world. If you're going into Indochina, if you're going into Africa, if you're going into the Middle East, this is a super solid trait to have because you will be generating a lot less infamy, all things considered. And that is super good in the mid-game when you're trying to build up your diplomatic reputation around the world, and you will be able to go to war a lot more frequently and take a lot more land, which once again, great thing. I will put that in B tier tentatively, but this very much can rise to S depending on what you're using and what build that you have. Next up, we have foreign investment. I'm going to put this one in a low A, maybe high B. The first perk is really good. You get increased leverage from economic dependence. At tier 2, you get a minus 50% cost for nationalization, and at tier 3, you get the ability to have foreign investment rights in power block members with a lower rank than you. This is really cool in theory, but in my opinion, tier 2 and 3 are kind of useless. Tier 2 is not that great because I'm going to be honest, a lot of the time you're running laissez-faire. If you're not running laissez-faire, this is good, but laissez-faire disables nationalization, so it's not really useful in this case. Tier 3 is also kind of neat, but it's also not difficult to get foreign investment rights. I understand what they're going for, you don't have to actually have the influence necessary, or at least I believe you don't. If you do, then it's even more useless, and I would put this way lower than B. But aside from that, the increased leverage is about the only good part of this perk, but it is so good that it keeps it from being in C tier or D tier. Moving on, we have Creative Legislator, and at tier 1 you get minus 33% enactment stall chance, at tier 2 you get minus 33% movement to preserve and restore law support, and then you get a setback at tier 3. I think this is pretty solid. I'm not going to put it in S tier. Initially, I thought this was way better than it actually ended up being. This can be pretty good if you're struggling to pass certain laws, but it is very niche. I'm going to put it in B tier for now. Moving on again, we have Sacred Civics. This one is super gimmicky. I'm going to put it in C tier, maybe even in D tier. This can absolutely be a ton of fun. I've seen some great playthroughs with people doing some hilarious stuff. At tier 1, you get a higher diplomatic proposal acceptance chance for countries of the same religion. At tier 2, you get reduced liberty desire for the same religion, and at tier 3, you can impose your same church and state law on Bloc members. That's pretty cool. It's gimmicky, I'm not gonna lie to you. The higher diplomatic proposal acceptance rate is pretty nice. I can imagine that could be good for getting countries into your power block, but if you're playing as a nation that doesn't have the rest of the world as the same religion as you, it's not going to be that good. Like Qing China, for example, doesn't really get much actual use out of this, other than some gimmicky bonuses. Once again, C tier, maybe even D tier. Moving right along once again, we have Internal Trade. At tier 1, you get a plus 10% company throughput bonus and 20% convoy contribution to market owner. Then at tier 2, you get plus 10% infrastructure, 30% convoy contribution to market owner, and also 20% tariffs on imports and exports outside of the power block. Then at tier 3, you get plus 40% convoy contribution to market owner, and minus 25% convoy cost of port connections. This one's a high A for me, super solid, great buffs, company throughput bonus is amazing, I personally really love it. A lot of other people may overlook that part of it, but this is definitely a high A for me, even pushing into the lower S tier. This is one of those things where it may not do an active thing for your country that you notice all the time, but it just makes expanding your economy that much easier and makes your GDP grow that much faster. Then we have market unification. At tier 1, you cannot place an embargo on another power block member, and you also get a plus 10% company throughput bonus. Then you get plus 20% tariffs once again, and 10% infrastructure. Then at tier 3, you get a customs union on everyone in your power block, as well as 40% convoy contribution to market owner. It's very similar to internal trade. This one's just more specific for trade leagues. I think this is alright. This is, in my opinion, kind of a worse variant of internal trade. You're going to usually be able to get customs unions anyway, and being able to no longer place an embargo on another power block member doesn't really matter. I think the developers thought that we would be being antagonistic to our power block members a lot more often than we are. In my opinion, once you get someone in your power block, you're being nice to that person for the rest of the time. I cannot think of a logical situation where I'd want to place an embargo on a power block member, so in my opinion, this is just a slightly worse variant of internal trade. Instead of high A to low S, I'm going to go middle A, maybe a high A if you get like super solid with this, and if you want Trade League to be your central identity pillar. Moving on again, we have aggressive coordination. At tier 1, you get minus 30% war goal maneuver cost for the diplomatic play initiator. Then you get minus 15% war exhaustion from casualties. And then at tier 3, you get minus 10 power block cohesion, plus 15% infamy generation, and you can call your power block members with the call ally sway in all diplomatic plays. Once again, this is just one of those things that's not super good. In my opinion, war goal maneuver is just not that important. This doesn't really give you offense or defense. It just gives you a war exhaustion reduction, which I guess is pretty neat. But once again, not very good. I could see this one being a negative for a lot of people. I'm going to put it in C tier for now. Maybe I'm missing something here, but I just don't really get the appeal of something like aggressive coordination. Then we have external trade. External trade is pretty solid in my opinion, but it's not at the same tier as everything else. This is probably a middle to high B in my opinion. It's solid. It doesn't have any huge, detractors, but it's just not as good as some of those other specific traits. At tier 1, the power block gets minus 75% trade route bureaucracy cost with any other power block member. Also, all power block members get minus 25% trade route bureaucracy cost and plus 25% trade route competitiveness. At tier 2, you get influential trade center for trade centers, which gives you influence and migration attraction. This one's really nice. This is the saving grace of this trait. And then at tier 3, you can also establish a trade route without interest. I'm gonna be completely honest though. I'm running this right now as, my setup. And I have a lot of influence, as you can see. But I'm also gonna be real with you. It's not doing so much for me. Like, in terms of the amount of influence that I'm getting from the trade centers, it's just not a huge amount. It's already 1910. I am getting quite a bit from it. 214 from Florida. I'm getting 34 from Mississippi, 22 from Virginia. But at the same time, I just am not feeling a huge amount of influence from the perk, and therefore I'm ranking it a little bit lower because of that. Maybe if I noticed it a little bit more in my gameplay, I would rank it much higher, because influence is very much needed as part of 1.7. Just, in my opinion, not the greatest thing in the world. Divine Economics is next, and I'm going to be honest, I don't really love this one a crazy amount. Starting off with Power Block, you get plus 50% devotee trade route competitiveness, as well as 50% income transfer from heathen subjects. Then you also get increased clergy oversight for financial districts and manor houses. This is just a different setup, gives you some clergymen. And at tier 3, you also get a reduction in radicals from living standard decreases in accepted religions, and also bonus loyalists from standard of living increases in accepted regions, which is pretty interesting. In my opinion, maybe this gets a high B. I could see some niche use cases if you're playing as someone like Britain, for example. You're conquering in different parts of the world. You want to get that income transfer. But I think some of the other economic-related principles are definitely a little bit better than this one. I'm going to go B, maybe a low B on this one. I do see some use cases for this, but once again, I just don't really get it, I guess, and that's just a me personal thing. Exploitation of members is the next one. It gives you power block cohesion reduction, as well as bonus authority at tier 1, and for the non-leader block members you get negative authority. At tier 2 you get negative 10 power block cohesion, and then influence, and a reduction of influence for everyone else. And then at tier 3 you get bonus income transfer. I think this one's really good, actually. This one gives you a lot of authority, a lot of influence. If you're playing a almost fascist country with a lot of those types of laws, you're going to be building up a crazy amount of authority, all things considered. The cohesion hit is not great, but once again, if you're playing as like Britain, Sovereign Empire, these things can very much add up to be a lot of benefits with not too many losses. And also you get that income transfer, which once again, playing as Britain, big nations, this can be very useful. I'm going to give this one an A. In certain nations, it can definitely be super strong, but obviously if you're playing as a much smaller country, you will have a lot less effectiveness from this. Lastly, we have Ideological Truth. At tier 1, you get minus 33 popularity of agitators in opposition, as well as a reduction in suppression and bolstering costs. At tier 2, you get plus 20% party whip impact on ideological incoherence, which is basically a bonus or a penalty to the effect that party whip has on the ideological opinion of the rest of the party members. I know, very silly. But basically, this just makes it so if you have a specific leader of a party with a certain, let's just say, radical, humanitarian, this will kind of benefit you in that regard. And then at tier 3, you get plus 25 minimum legitimacy, which in my opinion is actually pretty good. The problem is I don't really think in the game right now there are too many issues with setting up laws. Laws are one of the most gamed part of this video game. You can very easily pass whatever laws you want, whether that be through the form of revolutions, whether that be through making countries pass laws for you, whether that be in the form of, political lobbies. It's very easy to set up your government the way you want it. I just don't really see the appeal of this. I'm going to give it a low B, maybe even a high C. It's just not very good, although I will say the minimum legitimacy is very nice, prevents you from falling into that lowest tier, so you could theoretically always pass laws, which in my opinion I guess is pretty solid, but at the same time I don't really see the benefit of the rest of this, because I'm not usually having too much trouble to pass the laws I want. Maybe if you're playing as a certain nation where you really want to get something passed, like Russia, you want to get off of traditionalism, you want to get to laissez-faire, this could definitely have use. But at the same time, I think something like Creative Legislator over here would also be fairly good for you. You could probably combine those two together and get something good happening, but same time, I just don't think this is too amazing. Wrapping up here, I will say, I think the vast majority of principles in the game are very good. You may notice that I was very sparing in giving out Ds. I gave out no Fs at all, and that's because I think literally every principle has some theoretical usage, even if some of them are not too great. Some of the S tier ones I feel like I'm going to be picking up in pretty much every run I play, but I tend to play a lot of the bigger nations, things like France, things like Britain, the United States. Sometimes I play Qing China, Japan as well. All of those nations are relatively larger and could use some of those bigger overall principle groups and bigger overall principles as a whole. But aside from that, I will say, I think Paradox did a great job on balancing for this, because I don't feel like there's just one principle that you need to have, and there definitely is a lot of discussion that you should be having as a player on which ones you want to go for. For example, I put a lot of things in A and B, and that doesn't mean that those specific A or B tier things are bad, they're on the upper end of that spectrum anyway. That means that you have to think about, okay, what am I going for? Am I going for, maximum population? Then you want to go freedom of movement. You want to get all of those buffs to your nation. You want to get a huge economy. You go things like internal, external trade, get a bunch of buffs in that direction, and you could just be blowing up by like 1910, have 815 million GDP. And this is not even like a super max game. You could do way better than me. You want to go full economic imperialism. You do stuff like, I don't know, for example, exploitation of members, max out that authority. There's just a lot of stuff you can do in this game, and I'm very thankful that this update has added that ability to the game, because I'm really enjoying all of the customization you have, and I hope you guys are too. This is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe down below. And look forward to future videos. I hope you enjoy them as much as you may or may not have enjoyed this one. Leave your thoughts down below. I would love to hear what you guys think. Do you think I got one totally wrong? I definitely could have. I'm not the best at this game. I would love to hear what you guys think. So, yeah. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.